Okay. Welcome to the June 2nd, 2025 meeting of the Climate Action Committee. Under Governor Baker's emergency order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, GLC 30A S20 issued March 12th, 2020, and in effect until termination of the emergency. Meeting of public bodies may be conducted virtually, provided that adequate access is provided to the public. In March 2025, the remote public meeting provision was extended through March 2027. So here we go. And first item is minutes from last.
Can't vote on them.
Oh, right. I will recommend their approval.
A second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I,
You can do a roll call.
You,
Yeah.
you have to do it, you have to do a vote, roll call vote, because you have remote members.
Right, we're doing a roll call.
Okay.
Michael?
Aye, yes.
Fred?
Yes.
Paul Malta?
Aye.
Paul Delariva?
I,
Barry?
Aye.
I abstain, I was there.
Okay, and the chair votes aye. There we go. And the main thing we're going to be talking about is kind of go through the draft, the embodied carbon primer that Stephen put together with his group. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today because he's traveling, and I don't think anyone else that reviewed it with him could make it either. That said, I think it'd be good to go through it and kind of get a sense of where we might make recommendations and things that ways he might want to shape it. And so I threw together a couple of talking points pulled out of the memo that they wrote, and thought I'd start really just with a reminder of why we're here. Namely that, and this is straight from our charter from the select board of what we're supposed to do, because in the past we've sort of talked, well, we're limited as far as what the town can do and what town buildings, and we have one major town construction project in the near term and then some renovations. So really that as we look at this and any of these policies, we're looking at the second bullet point really in terms of what we can do on a community-wide basis, both municipal as well as non-municipal and residential, to identify and prioritize these various goals. And I would say embodied. So when we're looking at the embodied carbon discussion, we're really looking at okay, we've identified some things. How do we prioritize? What do we think might make sense for Needham? How might we take this over the next couple of years as we look at the next phases of the roadmap? So that's kind of what I thought of as the context for going through this. Yeah.
I have some thoughts on this. I'm gonna stop at my house, grab my computer. I'd like, I think we're gonna be on this a while, but I'll get there in like 15 minutes. I'd like to talk about it with specific reference to a major project that's coming up. So, but I'll do that. I'd rather do that when I get there and do it.
Okay, and we will have, we have the actual report up
Yeah.
if we want to go to it.
Right.
Okay,
All right.
I would like to, as far as a short-term goal, actually, long but short is, I'd like to connect the embodied carbon aspect to the large house review committee, even though that's not directly in charge per se, but I'd like to bring a connection to that part of it, the study that's going on, to the large house review committee. That would be useful to talk about.
definitely. And there's, do you want to go to the next? Cause um. What we had, I mean, really. Um. This is the summary of the summary in terms of, what we're looking at, is, where this fits in the puzzle and, in terms of, there definitely is an impact with, carbon, both the large house and the tree committee too.
Well, the stormwater, tree, large house, all three of those are connected, then we have a continuing connection here.
And, so part of as I see it, the initial thing is kind of even getting this concept across to people, because I've noticed even there's a lot of confusion. People talk about, the mandated carbon reductions. And a couple of things I've read, they slip in that we have, the state wants to be at net zero by 2050 or is required to be, but that's all what they call operational carbon. And not the embodied. So there's this whole, education, which I don't think I think we probably agree on, or, in general, that anything to do with
Well, I
building
mean,
anything.
I think internally we may agree on, it. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but externally wise.
Oh, externally,
A
no.
lot of people, they really don't understand what's going on with the house being torn down, as being rebuilt, what it means.
Oh, correct.
They think, oh, they're just building something, the material already exists, or the
Yeah,
house that's already built, what's there to lose? It's already built. The connection isn't there, and understandably so, I think, to a large extent, it's not understandably why it's not. It's important that, we can bring that connection.
So are what you're saying is that you want to try to spread this concept of embodied carbon and to all, so residential, municipal, and anyone else? Or do you want to have us operate first in a municipal fashion? Or, you know what I mean? Because what I like about the presentation is the case studies about who's done what in terms of local embodied carbon initiatives. I don't mean to jump to that.
no, we're jumping.
But the issue, when you look at what they've done, like they've basically done some things where they ask people to do life cycle analysis or to consider, embodied carbon. But none of these towns, all of them fairly progressive, as you can see, have really come up with a plan that is, to use a pun, concrete enough to, that was bad. That was bad, sorry.
You can educate and lead. The question
Yeah,
is,
so,
what do you, what is the ultimate goal? There's obviously.
but if you look at Cambridge and Newton and Brookline and Amherst, all of these things were sort of like, well, we want you to look at embodied
Right.
carbon. But no one's telling anyone really what to do yet.
Right,
So there's no mandates except for larger projects need to be evaluated in that vein. So it's hard. It's a lot of work.
Oh, it is, and this is a start, Fred.
The only concrete requirement that I read in these case studies was to delay demolition. And I was wondering if anyone knows what the heck that means, to delay demolition.
I mean, I know in Wellesley, for example, there is I think it's part of their large house.
1 year.
1 year. My understanding is it still pretty much happens. They just factor that in to the process.
it's like with historic homes. You can't, you gotta, you have a waiting period, but again, the economics make sense, you're gonna factor that in and.
I mean-
It doesn't really, maybe people think twice, but.
There's a 6-month demolition delay on the historic homes on the,
Right.
they're listed, right? And I know this.
And realistically, how many of that is, right, and realistically, how many did it really prevent at the end of the day? If that made economic sense.
I mean, one of the things that, I summarized some of the things from the report, and actually I took Newton out because that got removed when they went to do this law affecting larger additions and commercial buildings. That didn't pass, and so I think one of the things that we're looking at is both sort of this education, laying the groundwork, because no matter what the town does, people are gonna say, we didn't know. And then the question of how can this, educating other committees and, looking at how to get this concept across in the same way that people now recognize that flooding is a problem in a way that they didn't 5 years ago, and then sort of what are these practical things we can do, carrots and sticks, and what are what can we learn from some of the roadblocks? For example, it was proposed in Newton. I mean, they've had a hellacious time in Newton.
What was proposed?
happened?
There, I don't know. Well, they
What
were
was the- what are you
proposing,
referring to?
they are requiring electrification as part of this electrification pilot for large buildings and large additions. And I think at some point they had life cycle analysis in there for carbon. It's not in the final law.
Well, the electrification, the requirement for electrification is the bigger issue for these bigger buildings.
Yeah,
Especially energy intensive, that may be industrial buildings that may be energy intensive. That caused the big concern and, probably limited.
and
Yeah.
that was something in Newton, for example. Newton Wellesley lobbied. And suddenly large healthcare facilities within the city of Newton, of which
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah,
there's one.
yeah, yeah.
Are exempt from some of these in part because they can't electrify.
Correct.
Uh,
But more importantly, some of the potential proposed. New buildings, whether particularly in the lab
Yeah.
space, threaten to back off because it can't make it work economic.
and so the question, I mean, the good thing, I think, is it gives us a little bit of chance
Yeah.
to learn, and I think everybody is recalibrating some of these discussions. Which goes back to that education, like you were saying about the large houses. Cause I saw that discussion within reading some of the materials from Green Newton about their denser zoning plan. That basically by limiting house size and allowing more density, will it by default that reduces embodied carbon?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that aspect, and we were in a fairly intense conversation with the people in Wellesley, we talked to some other towns as well. And, the phrase behind.
When you
the
say
curve-
we, it's the large
The
house.
large house review committee, yeah. Not the planning board, large house review committee, so, the phrase behind the curve. So Needham's been behind the curve and other things for a number of years, and Wellesley was ahead of it. And so they have smaller houses they have smaller houses and larger lots, and we're gonna be talking about that, how that impacts. What we do going forward. But-
Wellesley has smaller houses?
Well,
They have bigger lots.
bigger lot,
Oh.
relatively speaking, yeah, on some of the lots, you could argue, but they are they've been ahead of the curve as far as what's happening. With the size of houses actually, in fact, and they do have acreage lots and their maximum size that they're allowing on that before you go to a large house review special permit style situation. I mean, Needham's been behind the curve, but we're trying to catch up to some, we're trying to have some type of curve here.
Yeah,
What we're doing in the large house review, and the same thing can be true as far as educating people on embodied carbon. The word embodied carbon, or the phrase, I find a very odd term in some, I get it, but it's a very odd term in some ways, and there's no other term we can use. But I'm not sure, you know, people have to grab an understanding what that means. And think of it that, I don't know why, but I just find it odd. Like I said, there's maybe no other term to use.
Gabby, do you have any sense of taking a, sort of all positions approach where we hit all areas where embodied carbon could come up? Or is it beyond too difficult to do and focus on municipal? Or is residential too cantankerous and a difficult issue? Like, I mean, do you have any sense of these examples about problems that occurred? Or have you heard anything?
I think at this stage, we might need to do some more information gathering. I don't know the answer to that question. I think getting a better sense from these 4 communities about what implementation has looked like and what challenges there may have been, would be really helpful. So I think that would be a good starting point, and to also get a sense of like staff time requirements, if there were education campaigns that were included as part of this effort. I think that information would be really helpful. Yeah, I think we need to start at that point before we start trying to decide whether to focus on municipal, residential, commercial. I think this is like a great starting point for getting a foundation of the issue. I just think we need to delve a little bit deeper into what some of the potential focus areas might be.
I was
Yeah,
wondering,
it-
it seems like one of the big issues, at least based on this document, is that towns don't have the authority to set their own codes that are more stringent than the state. At least that was my understanding.
correct.
That seems like a pretty big barrier to, it limits your sticks considerably. And then, you know, any sort of carrots are sort of out of the pocket of that town, which is also really hard. I wonder if it's worth trying to get a group of folks from these different towns and see what sort of pressure can be put on the state capital, the state legislator, to amend some of those, or sort of not necessarily allow like a full-blown set of each city can have its own, you know, codes, but something related to this. I wonder if other towns have tried to work with state officials, and I think it'd be interesting to learn from that, because honestly, for me, when I read that, it was just like that's like a pretty big barrier.
I think some of it could tie in, there was an effort. Brookline tried to require electrification for new construction and got shot down by the Attorney General. And they then set up this pilot program that allowed certain towns to do that, so Brookline, Newton, I think Cambridge is in it.
Yeah. 9 or 10 communities, guys.
And, you know, West Tisbury and, but I think that was something that Newton was trying to incorporate. You know, can you require, it seems to be that requiring a life cycle analysis seems to be the.
Yeah, I
the
mean, just
foot-
doing the report seems to be the most that we can ask folks to do, right? And then it's like, well, great. You've demonstrated that your building has a lot of embodied carbon, and like there's no incentive or reason for them to look at other materials and, you know, I think one of the things that I found really interesting a couple years ago, I was researching the insulation that's blown into houses, right? And the closed cell insulation that you see everywhere, right? That you like initially think, oh, it's the best way to provide a vapor and thermal barrier to the house, that the global warming potential of the propellant used for that is awful. It's like there's basically no it's almost worse to put it in, right? You might as well have like an uninsulated house and have it like operationally run off of renewables than to put in that insulation. For me, I didn't know that, right? And so it's like you could do these LCAs, and I don't know, I just think like there's got to be a way to. I know like taxes and fees are sort of impossible words to throw around, but it almost seems like you need to have like a reference carbon intensity for a building, and then, you know, if you want to go above that, then you need to pay in order to do so. And maybe you can structure it as like your building permit is going to be more expensive instead of saying it's a carbon fee or a carbon tax or whatever sort of other word is that's untenable politically. But I just think it's worth trying to get the state involved.
Hey, Paul, where's, I mean, I like education as a first step in anything. Like, where is the I don't remember ever seeing that, what you're referring to, Paul, as far as the effect of closed cell or open cell. It's the same thing as compared to not, you know, not doing anything and just that's powering by renewables, or perhaps a comparison of that to some other insulation factor.
No.
I would also be careful of going down a rabbit hole, because you will have people who will will resist this and will come up with a way to tell you, oh no, this is much worse.
Mhm.
And you know, you could spend your time spinning your wheels, because anytime you do something like this, someone will come up with something that says, oh no, it'll be much worse. This costs a lot because, and it's not always reliable. I think you need to be careful about something that's as absurd as we shouldn't insulate the house at all because of, you know.
I'm not.
I know, I'm just saying, I think.
That's not what Paul is.
Yeah, I'm
No,
not-
I know, but I think we have to be careful about, you know, worrying about.
I think it's a question really, I mean, and jump in if I'm wrong, Paul, but you know, when you look at the EPDs, the environmental product designation,
Yeah.
disclosure, I hate acronyms. You know, when you look at the detailed numbers, you could then doing back of the envelope, and we're not looking at that, and we don't want to, you know, we're looking sort of at the broader issue that. But the question is, this is why it's important.
I think also, there is a new embodied carbon council that's been formed from
Yeah.
state legislation, who should be helping to move things along at the state level. But I think I'm happy to reach out to other communities and see who else kind of has this on, you know, on the list of items to prioritize within their climate action priorities. I think this is a situation where we would be ahead of the state to put something in place. But that's not to say that we can't also continue to keep an eye on what's happening with this new council and share with our legislators that this is something that is included within our climate action roadmap, and that there are other communities who also have it in their roadmaps as well. So I think more is coming from the state, and I think there is growing interest and pressure, but I don't think it's materialized yet fully.
In Brookline there, if you look at Brookline, they did two things, which I thought was pretty good, which is the demolition delay, which is a delay. And then they tried to make a resolution about actually using low carbon concrete, like better than 10%. So the question I have for them, if it's worth exploring, is did anyone do this? Did a building get built with a more efficient process since
Yeah.
this resolution went in 4 years ago? So they, in some ways, had the most forward-thinking process, and question I would ask is, what's happened since then, you know, so. I don't know out of the four that we would call, cause you know, you start cold calling people and, you know, which one is it worth talking to the most, but I'd be curious as to what they have to say.
Brett?
Yeah, is the goal of a demolition delay to try to have the owner change their mind about rebuilding, or is it to give them time to research some recycling options? Do people know the answer to that? I mean, where does the material go when people just do a knockdown? Curious.
Does get, some of
Well,
it does get.
but I think a lot of it, I mean, to the first point, that's a really good question. It's almost as if you have a demolition delay. Unless you say something like, you know, you can do it quicker if you find someone to take 50% of the materials away, take your house apart.
Yeah.
But most of the material, like a lot of it goes to, gets, the concrete gets crumbled on some things. And some of it just gets buried on site.
I don't know of any, actually, I don't know of anything gets buried on site. I mean, you're talking
Okay.
the industrial building?
No, I'm talking about houses, I'm talking about a certain development on.
I mean,
Here.
you can, I
Where
mean, part of
rocks
the
are
point of the
laid.
delays is obviously to encourage people. Reuse it.
But
And
you
to
need-
your point, it often doesn't,
It
but
doesn't.
that was one point, I think Paul also made the, you know, the idea that perhaps the idea of having the embodied carbon as part of the requirement, right? Maybe it costs you more, it costs you less to get a, you know, building permit, takes you longer. You know, the things you can do to get that information, which would be valuable to have.
And that comes into sort of the carrot thing that if you. You know, if somebody's going for a special. Permit, if they. It's expedited to some degree if they have a life cycle.
I mean, the need, if someone's tearing a house down, building a new one, it doesn't hit.
It's by right.
It's by
anyway.
right unless there's something, something obscure about the lot that
Yeah.
goes out of conformity or something.
But it almost seems like what we're. On the one hand, we're looking at ways, it's kind of like when you're trying to get your kid to eat more vegetables. Except we're trying to define what a vegetable is. So we want to sneak the vegetables into the pancakes, but we don't even know what they are, and we're trying to get an awareness. Of embodied carbon both among ourselves and then within planning, large house. You know, PBPC actually has a very good concept of it, but.
Well, the
Within
large,
private sector.
yeah, the planning board is scheduled to have the large house review, feed them something. Late fall, early winter, get on the planning board, then have something ready for May town meeting of next year. So it'd be nice to have some aspect of what are, you know, within our committee, what is embodied, what does it mean for embodied carbon?
Which I think.
What does it actually mean?
Since Stephen's not here, we could make that something. That could be a takeaway for this. Committee to give you something, even if it's a whereas. To say that this is why it's important and this is why it.
Here's the climate committee, we have a mission, we have a goal, we have a time frame. Here's something, we recognize this, here it is.
So do we need to write already a statement to present to his committee? We're nice to talk about
I
it.
mean, my feeling is it's something we could. And I wish Stephen were here, but he's traveling, something to work on, you know, that. Both with his subgroup and then the committee as a whole to have something. For large house for, you know, by, you know. August.
So we have our first public hearing this next Monday. Okay. Then after that, our next public hearing will probably be, give or take September 15th, then we'll have a third one. So it'd be nice. What's that?
Brought up this
Yeah.
coming one.
No, well, it can be, but maybe it's useful now, maybe it's useful to get it, make sure that all the ducks are in a row. Bring it up Monday or bring it up in the September one. I mean, this is the first one, or bring it up in both. It's fine by me. Doesn't matter to me how many.
Is the large house committee already causing issues with anxiety?
No, I don't think so. I mean, There's some
Started
people,
it.
yeah, I mean, we.
Sometimes you hear things.
Yeah, we've just been talking about, here are various things we can do. We haven't talked about anything that we're doing. We've decided nothing. We have a charge of what we're doing. And that's what it is right now. I mean, it was before we even started, there were some people like, oh, you shouldn't change anything. Some people were like, stop everything. So there were already the two camps already. Where we go, where it goes from here, I don't know. I truly, I mean,
Well, I think
we're trying to get as much information, as much publicity, as many people know way in advance as possible. And this type of thing would be useful to have in people's minds.
Yes. I think that is actually like beyond this sort of loose discussion we're having. I think this would be a great thing
Mhm.
for the CAC. And, you know, we can delegate it to our embodied carbon working group to
Structure something.
structure a couple of, you know,
Yeah.
doesn't even have to be
Mhm.
recommendations, but something which honestly for the tree committee
Well,
as
here's the
well.
facts. Here are the facts.
And this is why it's important,
Yeah.
you know, so we're introducing. These are vegetables and why you need to eat them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the large ice review committee will have anything in our decision making where we say something about that. I'm not sure, imagine that right now per se, but the more people in town, the more people know that this is a factor, this means something. The more people understand that the worth of what the committee is doing, in some houses reducing in size. Even if we don't have anything in there, which I don't know if we will, but the more people know about it, the more they'll be in favor of it,
And I think also this, you know,
whatever it is.
some of the discussions we've had about. You know, the CAC doing outreach to other
Mhm.
town committees to say,
Mhm.
you know, this, by the way, this is what we do and. I don't know if I'm allowed to say intersectionality, but you know, how we intersect with things they're doing and. So I think that would be a good takeaway. And it's something that can. Affect the parts we don't have to direct.
Yeah, so we're gonna have at the meeting next Monday, we're gonna have, you know, statement of purpose, our charge. Then we'll have we might form into some tiny little group discussions perhaps, depending on people are there. Then we're gonna come back to comments, Q&As. And so at that point, that would be a perfect time to have someone, Stephen or someone wants to get up and just read what they found, read what it means.
Perfect.
Next Monday. Town hall.
One thing I was also gonna say, and going back to the codes as well as large house, I did read. That the HERS rating, which is required for the stretch energy code. Now has a component that can factor in embodied carbon. Or an LCA, I'm
Actually, I was
not,
just looking at HERS rating sheet the other day. And it was something about body, something sticking in there about that word possibly being on that sheet.
yeah, they
I'll
just
check.
added
Yeah,
and they're
yeah.
talking about. Adding embodied carbon to the 2027 International Energy Conservation Code. So. You know, knock on
So
wood.
can I clarify? So does this mean this term might get mentioned on Monday or not?
Only if it's someone from this committee or designee coming and speaking and saying, here's what we're looking at, here's what we found, here are the facts.
I mean, I don't know if I can speak. Just personally, I can speak personally, but as CAC,
Well, why
It might
can't,
be helpful to wait till Stephen is back.
Yeah.
and
I
ask
mean,
him if he's in charge
there's
of
plenty
it.
of time, this committee's gonna have a lot of stuff to work with.
Yeah.
But I think if you are there in September to say, we want to put this on your radar screen to think about, to understand what one of the implications of what we're doing with houses and outside, and potentially as you think about what you might choose to do, how this could be part of what it is.
but I think if a citizen were to say,
Mhm.
you know. I've heard about embodied carbon,
Mhm.
you know, this concept that. You know, even just the exhaust from the bulldozers,
I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with someone standing up And even if it's just some minor takeout, pull out from what you have.
We should ask.
And then on.
Yeah, no, if
then
you-
in September, you have
If
a
he
big one.
can be there,
Where's he on a trip or something?
I don't know if he's.
Italy or-
stay. I think it was a work thing, but.
Okay,
All right.
anyway, keep that in mind for that
Cool.
one day.
That's cool.
So I wanted to, for
Yes.
this piece of it, but in terms of municipal construction, actually all construction. One thing that you've said, and I think we ought to keep our eye on, and that our subcommittee ought to, is keeping an eye and being watchful of developments that would. There are increasingly lower carbon cements and things. So I think that's part of what this group should do as an ongoing, is to look at when there are, when things come into the mainstream that are available, that information is provided both to the building community generally and, to the municipality. So that was small, but I wanted to talk in the larger context about in the municipal context. The idea of embodied carbon and how you might address it then comes back to what's called adaptive reuse. In what context and how can you reuse all or parts of a facility when you are building, when you are repurposing it, when you are making changes to it? Because, it's just like the energy efficiency argument, right? The cheapest kilowatt is the one you don't use. So if you're using carbon, if you're not pouring new cement and you're not taking away old cement, you are clearly helping, right? So that's an important thing for us to think about. That said, you also do not want the tail shouldn't wag the dog. You need to start for any building with, what's the intended purpose? Is there a possibility to do it? Now, that's what we did with the Emery Grove, and that was part of the discussion, right? The adaptive reuse, the idea of the embodied carbon that we would be saving by not tearing that building down was one of the arguments that we made, and it worked very effectively because the building is now, as I think almost everyone would agree, is a fabulous building, right? And it's incredibly energy efficient. Now, one of our most energy efficient buildings in town. So that's something to think about. I bring this up because for this town, the largest project we're gonna do coming up is the Pollard rebuild, okay? We're talking about 220,000 square feet probably of space. And this is a topic that will probably come up, it will probably be discussed as the designer looks at, because the designers that came to speak for the design review, for the designer selection process. Some talked about, oh, here's some ways you could reuse, here's some new stuff. And so the MSBA and the building committee obviously will drive that process. I would say that looking at Pollard today as a mid-century modern building that has serious problems, it's hard for me to imagine repurposing any of it. I would also, my opinion, we're gonna be asking the community to put a lot of money to this project. I think you're gonna have a lot of people who have a much harder time saying, wait, you're just gonna, repair the, you're gonna add to that existing terrible building. Why am I spending that much? So that's just, I suspect that's the way we go, but it is something we should be aware of.
So has any of that stuff gotten into the discussion for Pollard yet?
Well, it will be part of it as the designer who's been selected starts to look at options, they have to look at everything, right? And the first thing we start with is the actual educational plan. So the principles of putting that together, that says, what do you need in the building? What do you need to meet your educational program? And then they look at different ways to design it, but there are, different possibilities that have been talked about. Right, both, in one large facility, 2 wings and so on. And it's going to be a very large building that's going to add significantly, probably, I don't know, it's gonna add how much, it'll be add to the carbon footprint to certainly, but then again, considering the current building is so damn inefficient, has so many problems. It's still gonna be a big improvement. But it's something that we should be aware of and thinking about, both in terms of the embodied carbon discussion, but in general.
So-
As we think about, energy use intensity.
I'm sure this has been done, I don't know how accessible it is, but like with Emery Grover. Throughout the whole process, is there? An easy comparison, say, well, terms of. Both the life cycle carbon analysis and the life cycle cost analysis. saying, well, you know, if we had built a new building, here's what it would have been in terms of dollars. Construction costs, operating costs, carbon. Instead, we did this, you know, then that can serve as a template to show people, here's why.
Probably
we
not,
use-
there's not a good apples to apples, because the alternatives, there weren't a lot of good alternatives
Okay,
and options at the end of the day.
because you couldn't tear it down.
You could have tear it down.
Well, we could have sold it to someone who would have.
Yeah.
And. You know, at the end of the day, you know, we spent a lot of money for a building for. That has a, yeah, limited amount of people operating in it. Anyway, that's a different discussion, but. It's. You know, when it was done well. It's,
Yeah,
I think the thing with Pollard, honestly, costs are gonna be. Take 90+% of the discussion at the end of the day.
yeah,
And, yeah, not that we shouldn't take these things into account and make people aware of it, and certainly when there are options that. You know, don't materially impact the overall budget. We should, yeah, it's fine, but I think at the end of the day, that it's not gonna drive the process.
no,
I just wanna put it on the radar screen, because often people will come up and say, oh, yeah, you're on dual energy stuff and you're tearing down a building, so. But also because, you know, construction will start. All things going well in 2028, so you have 3 years from now, and that's why it's also important to be very mindful. Of what is available, you know, are there lower concrete, you know, lower carbon concrete that are at a good price point, because that stuff's happening. Right, steel and you know, the materials that you choose to use, and the designer will, you know, will certainly incorporate that into the thinking, but it's something that I
one,
wanna keep an eye on.
one of the other things that I really liked that. Maybe gets short shrift, in this draft report and, you know, it's mentioned under what Boston is doing in terms of deconstruction. Where,
Mhm.
you know, they take those steel beams, that'll come out of the gym. And instead of just melting them down, you just give some for scrap. You know, is there a way to find a home for them? And putting that into the planning process and maybe, you know, that's something that. Can be part of the, you know, longer term discussion.
Yeah,
I think
on the
that-
vineyard, we have to, if you wanna tear a house down, you have to offer the house itself for relocation, for habitat. You know, that's an option.
And that's something I've heard of people doing.
We did it actually, we actually donated our cottage and we built on the lot, but.
And you get a tax deduction for that. don't
Yeah,
you?
it ended up being a wash, and the tax deduction was probably equivalent to what it cost, the cost to actually move the house.
Okay,
But, yeah, we're happy that it got reused. Yeah, I don't know, I think it may be unique because it's an island, you know, to be honest with you,
I've heard about Habitat doing that in other communities where they will, especially if it's a. You know, a house that's built with. Nice materials, you know, they'll take a teak deck.
right,
Yeah, and there's folks out in Western Mass who do the recycling stuff, the nonprofit, they actually.
yeah, there are groups that will.
There are
come
groups
in
that will try to do that. We actually
Yeah.
tried to work with them to do an educational process for builders, because there's stuff that they would gladly take.
Right, exactly.
Right, and instead of carting it to a landfill, paying to
Right.
dispose of it, the builders actually.
Yeah.
You know, then you don't need to a lot of incentive, because it costs them less to let somebody take it away, repurpose it, than it does to. Dispose of it.
Yeah, I think this, again, there's really good examples in here and being able to talk to these communities and figuring out what is working or didn't work and how they did the education piece would be helpful. Maybe there needs to be like a second iteration of the primer that delves in a little bit.
Honestly, there's
Deeper.
probably stuff for more for your committee than.
What's that?
There's more stuff probably that would be useful
Oh,
for your
yeah,
committee.
oh, yeah, as far as that
And
goes.
you can, you know, the reality is, I think, you know, we have more ability to. If you wanna talk about enforcements, that's the. You know. Whatever changes can be made in zoning to limit, or do much more, right,
And that's why we get the small room and they get the big room.
Right.
Well,
But I think-
more people in person.
What we can do is, really try to feed and support these aspects, and maybe also, I know it's easy to sort of dump on you, Gabby, but within the sustainability managers community, if there are people that, somebody in Brookline or, that you could get somebody for one of us to contact,
Yeah.
whether as CAC or let's say Michael or me as Green Needham, to say, well, okay, or Stevens Group, what's being done?
Yeah, I can do that.
So it seems like there's sort of two things. There's just sort of longer term municipal goal with Pollard. And then there's this issue with houses. So there are these two avenues. To me, it's like the house is actually really important because, once they get built, it's over. It's like these things roll fast. I mean, I don't know how many more new houses are being torn down. How many houses are being torn down now compared to before? It seems quieter than it was.
Well, part of it, I think that's the economy.
Right,
not-
that's, I
not
think
the
that's
state
pure
houses,
economic.
yeah.
But it's gone up and down, but yeah, 80, 90 a year, it's just that just is what
I
happened.
think-
And some of it is gonna happen, even regardless, just because they're
Right.
buildings, they just need to be done. It's,
But you're also seeing, I think maybe it's just where I live that. Where you have a 2,000 square foot house on a half acre lot
Oh, yeah, that's gone.
is being split into 2/4 acre lots with a 5 or 6,000 square foot house.
yeah, it's just.
And you're gonna see every half acre lot in town is gonna, if it's in a 10,000 square foot zoning area.
There's only so many of those though,
Is-
but, yeah, well, and that's, that part of the other thing for part of the demolition delay, properties like that. Or any kind of property is that often, the problem is not that somebody, for a house that's in good shape, right, that somebody would actually want to inhabit, that you look at and say, why did they tear it down? The challenge is not that that the developer's willing to pay that much more, they're not generally, okay? The challenge is the developers have the loan, they can just say, here, you can turn over the keys and leave tomorrow.
And that's that's part of that's part of the conversation though, because if. Whatever
Right.
whatever you vote on, the town votes on eventually, it's having some reduction. If in theory, then the house is being, I use the word in theory, the house is being sold for less. In theory, maybe it costs less to build, but then also in theory, the developer won't necessarily wanna pay as much in theory. But then at the same time, maybe some of those people that would love to move into Needham, all of a sudden, maybe they start having a foothold into that same house.
Well, they do because if you wanna buy a house, right, there's a whole bunch of stuff you have to do, inspections, you have to get
Oh, yeah.
recorded, right? And so a lot of the time I've talked to
Yeah.
both the realtors and others, and it's part of the equation,
Yeah.
right? It's not that the developers are paying that much more.
They can't.
It's, they can't move as quick, so when you have a delay, it gives people time.
But
So that the homeowner doesn't lose from
Yeah,
that.
they can't, they can't move as quick, but also many times it doesn't even hit the market. It's not even there. It's
Yeah.
gone. It's simply not there. But if it gets there, who knows what would happen? But if the developers are all of a sudden, maybe not paying as much, maybe. Then the other thing, we've also talked about the fact that, whatever change comes about, whatever change, whatever it is, it could just be a blip as far as, okay, there's a little blip in the housing prices. I would like to see the houses a lot smaller, a lot less, so forth, but there may just be a blip because Needham's Needham. 4 train stations, the hospital sitting right there, great schools, people wanna move to Needham, who knows what impact it's gonna have and price of houses at all. I have no idea, but I do know that, people don't like their yards being flooded out. They don't like that, they don't like all the trees being torn down around them. The exact thing that we're charged with on the committee isn't necessarily anything related to that. It's what are the size of the houses, like, we use with the storm bylaw, with the tree committee, dealing with some other stuff. But again, it's all tied together, it's all tied together within this. And I gotta take off my meeting. Guys.
Yeah, so I think,
30.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
thanks.
Yes, okay, I'll see you guys next, thanks.
So going back to your summation, Paul, I think we're looking at. Providing some sort of focused input to both the large house committee and the tree committee. To sort of get this concept of embodied carbon out there. Doing some, maybe if you could introduce us, have your content, some networking for. us to do some homework.
Okay.
And then, you know, it seems as far as the municipal buildings and from what I think Lynn was saying at the last couple of meetings when this topic has come up, that the PPPC has a decent handle on the question of doing life cycle analysis and
Well,
not
so,
explicitly on embodied carbon.
yeah, so LCA's already happened for projects, but the focus is on carbon as it relates to operation.
Yeah,
Not
okay.
on embodied carbon, so I think it's a new topic to consider. I think again, getting back to more of the information gathering with Emery Grover, that analysis with embodied carbon was not done, but I know from talking to Hank, he had a high school intern this spring start to look at what would have to be considered for an embodied carbon calculation of Emery Grover. And I think one of the suggestions in this draft was doing some tracking of our projects and seeing what factors go into that. And I think that would be helpful and maybe something to think about with Pollard, because I agree with Michael. I don't know that this is something that would be ready for a conversation with Pollard, but maybe there's a way that we could look at some of those considerations that are going in and how costs are comparing with different alternatives and have that be a case study that gets used going forward. I just think we need a little bit more data.
Yeah,
It's gonna be about materials, but you know, the PPC always looks at that, and looks at that with the, you know, the contractors they work with, and that's part of the costing. So, you know, that's kind of what it's gonna come down to. Is there stuff available that would help reduce when you build a building?
Yeah.
Because at this point, the reality also is that other than some stuff for the new kind of getting the DPW, getting that building replaced, which is not a huge piece of moving people, the Pollard is a big project. All of our other municipal buildings are gonna be around for a long time. The only other one we have left, once you finally house the DPW staff, you know, properly, is Mitchell after Pollard. We're not gonna be building any brand new buildings because we've done them all. We're gonna be maintaining them and trying to keep them as efficient as possible.
I think one thing that reminds me of one question that came up when I was talking with Hank about this, which is how we will prioritize the costs of redoing a building, especially when it comes to building envelope, and for our buildings that we do have to maintain that do not have a great building envelope.
Right.
Versus like complete new construction and the benefits of having like a truly energy efficient building, but that we are generating more carbon with the new construction. Like, how will we choose to prioritize those? And there may be situations where there's like one that's a clear winner, but I know when I was talking with Hank about it, he was like, I don't think it's clear to me at this point. I think we need more direction about how we would rank those. Because we do have some buildings where we'll have to make substantial investments to the building envelope to
The older
have
buildings.
them be, yes, to have them be truly energy efficient.
and I mean, it also plays into financing to some degree, that reducing operational carbon, i.e. expenses, comes out of the town's operating budget as opposed to, you know, particularly with school building, if you're getting a certain amount reimbursed.
Well, it's also capital expenses.
But
But that, you know, that's true for, as the town looks at how it's going to have its, you know, it's different. How it's gonna manage its buildings and how you wanna do it. I think you pointed out being was a good one, and Hank has to also, building, maintenance folks have to think about things like, okay, when do you have to replace a roof, when you replace a roof, what else can you do? Right, that's kind of
Yeah.
for building envelope improvements and such like.
I agree, those are all folded in.
So really, one of the things maybe to come back to this with is the idea that we can look to maybe sharpen some of the recommendations as far as that calculus in terms of operational versus embodied carbon analysis and, what are some tools that specifically the town can use.
Yeah, like is there a good, I don't know, CAD program that accounts for each of those alternatives? I would hope so. But yeah, I think more information will be helpful.
And maybe, and some kind of guidance is just the need for that matrix, I think
Yeah,
is really rather than that's a good direction that we could go in.
yeah, I think it'll be helpful to have some good comparisons, because there may be some harder conversations for some of these buildings. too,
Yeah.
so. More information, the better.
Okay. Anything else? I mean, we're not really,
So it sounds like we have some goals for like getting into this more firmly with the housing thing for the September meeting. Maybe some addition, this week if we're lucky, rolling Stephen back into this.
Mhm.
And then a view towards this huge project going over time now.
yeah, and maybe the thing to do, I can connect with Steven and if he wants to watch this recording or have a discussion, we just sort of say, well, okay, what are a couple of takeaways we can from our
Again,
rambling
if
discussion.
you're gonna talk to a municipality.
Yeah, yes,
Probably, yeah.
yeah, I will identify the right contacts.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, I think,
It's good discussion.
yeah,
You know,
Oh,
so now,
I had a very short sustainability managers report. I think the only item I wanted to call out was that at the May 27th select board meeting, there was a vote to approve adoption of the draft municipal decarbonization roadmap. And our school superintendent also has sent a letter confirming support for adoption. So we are now have the green light to apply for climate leader communities. So we will be applying for that this month. The deadline for the application is June 30th, but we should have our application materials in plenty of time before that. Yeah, I think that was the only.
That's really terrific. I'm glad we're gonna be there.
yeah,
We're not gonna take as long as we have in the past to do these things.
Excited to get our.
we're getting
materials.
on that curve.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think that was it, everything else in there, I think it's pretty standard. So I don't have any questions.
Congrats on the grant you got, by the way.
Oh, thanks, yeah, for the LID, appreciate it.
Yeah, I like that. I'm glad we're able to do that, the blanket thing. That's great. Good.
Yes, yeah, that's officially submitted, so.
Good.
Fingers crossed.
Just
And what's the
remind me, the school buses, it's one bus or two buses that we're getting?
Is funding was approved for one
bus.
school bus.
Okay.
So we just got the contract finalized for our EV charger installer. So we're putting together information right now for Eversource. Relative to what additional power will be needed for the site. So the goal is that we'll progress with the charger installation, and right now we're hearing 6 to 12 months to get the bus. So once we're within that 12-month window, we'll start moving forward with the bus order.
Is the idea, and maybe this is too far down the road, but is the idea to only serve Newman routes, or will you sort of try to see how far you can push that bus with other routes from other schools?
I would have to double check with Shane about what routes will be covered with that school bus. We only own 4 school buses.
Hmm.
So at this time, any transitions that would happen for electric would happen with those 4 until we get to a point with our third-party contractor if they
Mhm.
choose to transition those other buses. But I can get back to you and confirm with Shane which routes are served by that bus.
I mean, I think
Okay.
part of the plan, I know part of the planning Ann did when we looked at this was making sure, and that was the reason for the level 3 charger, that the bus could meet all its routes. I mean, there's only so much drive. Frankly, Newman routes are frankly longer than some other routes because of the extent of the parts of the town they're in. So but I think it isn't limited by a route in any specific
Mhm.
way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I wonder, and this is maybe a topic for the future, but I think it'd be interesting to see how we can help the contractor that does the rest of the school buses. You know, how we can help them accelerate
Yeah.
plans to turn that fleet over.
Well,
yeah,
Yeah, Ann and I have been having this conversation for a while, about our contractor and all contractors. Our contractor just went through, it's a family-owned business, right? Just went through a transition to the next generation. So I'm hoping that since the next generation probably wants to have buses and keep this business going, that may help a little bit in getting them to think about this. The other thing that we've talked just only in general terms about was, talking with some of our nearby communities, about the possibility of, is there a place that you could locate, working with the utility, for an electric charging depot for a lot of buses,
Mhm.
right? That maybe multiple communities could use for their buses. Because right now, when buses, when they take them back to a depot to do work on them, they have to take them to wherever the company is, right? And for anything that they do, and there could be some advantages to the bus companies to be able to have something like that to serve multiple communities. So there's some ways that could encourage the bus providers, to help them move their business. Because they have the same reasons for doing this that we're telling, anybody who buys a car, right? I mean, you're gonna have these things that are going to last a lot longer. They're going to need much less maintenance. They're gonna be much healthier to drive and to sit in, right?
Mhm.
So, there's some incentives there, but it's really trying to work with some of those providers and find out where they are and encourage them to be thinking about this.
Still
Yeah.
a big differential on cost.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely.
Whether,
Yeah, no.
upfront and over the lifetime.
Well, over the lifetime, not so much. It's the upfront cost. that are
Well,
big.
it's less so over the lifetime, but obviously, but
Yeah, the upfront is still big, but again, as more of these buses are built, that differential
Yeah.
will get it.
yeah, more progress to come. But yeah, I think welcome having you join that conversation, Paul. Because I know it's gonna be something we continue to work on, so.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks.
Good.
Okay.
Any other related committee and work?
I missed the last few, was away.
Mhm.
And for the issue regard to getting EV charging. We obviously hadn't made much headway in terms of getting some sort of communication with apartment leadership or authorities about how that whole process goes. And I must say, it's quite difficult.
Yeah,
And so I thought of 2 things. One is our best use of time as we continue to advocate for residents to buy or lease EVs, to continue to try to probe ways to increase charging for locations that may not have them, or whether we should just continue to pound away at our typical resident who's gonna be turning their car over in the next 2 or 3 years and should buy an EV, or we would like them to buy an EV. And I'd make an argument that this whole business of getting the apartment buildings and large apartment dwelling centers to build chargers is gonna be a challenge for 2 reasons. one, because of the reimbursements and the federal funding for EVs, which is still ongoing, but could end. And I was talking to someone I know at one of the big dealers the other day, and he says, one day we hear they're gonna end, and one day we hear they're gonna be renewed, because there's a lot of politics involved. You know, we're talking about big companies like GM and Ford, and, you know, they've put a lot of energy into this stuff. And if the federal benefits were to be dropped, then the car makers would have to drop the prices of the cars. And he told me that that's plan B for them, which is that they're gonna drop the prices of their cars. So the point I'm trying to make is that one way or another, EVs are gonna continue to be built. And they're gonna be either competitive or slightly less competitive over time. And people within Needham who are of means, which is a lot of people, can still be on the market for an EV, whether by lease or by buying. So maybe that's just where we should just go, just continue to advocate with whatever means we need to do to make people's next car purchase be an EV, which is part of our original mandate when we did our document. So I just think that that's really where the big part of this is. Honestly, if you live in an apartment or you move in and you rent, your window for buying an EV is probably gonna be a little more challenging than a person who lives in a regular home. They probably have more money. So maybe we should just try to grab the biggest, lowest hanging fruit here and get as many people as we can to convert to EV ownership or leasing, as opposed to worried about the charging per se. Because most people are residential, they're gonna be able to charge by and large, or they're gonna do a charger, or get a charger. Most of the companies are offering chargers now, way discount, so the costs for adding a level 2 charger to drop rather dramatically. What do people think about what I just said?
I think the low hanging fruit piece, I completely agree with you. I think that has to be part of the outreach that happens regardless. On the incentives piece, though, I did just want to note that the utility incentives for multifamily are still there, and they're, from what I understand, woefully undersubscribed, and utilities are struggling to get multifamily residences on board. So I agree that there's federal uncertainty with the credits, and I am not feeling super optimistic at the moment. But the utility incentives are still good with Eversource, so I
I think
think
just
that
the
has to be
opposite of
clear.
what you said, I think, to Gabby's point, if you. People who own their own residences, they're gonna do what's in their best economic interest, or whether they're motivated for whatever reason. And they're not gonna be inhibited by necessarily as much by access to charging. Cause they have the ability to do it at home, it's if you're, I think you're much more likely to find. Adoption in multifamily if you provide them access to charging.
So I'm not sure that's the point I made. The point I made, well, I'll say it again because maybe it wasn't clear. You have a large group of people who live in residential, single family homes, a smaller group of people
Yeah.
who live in multifamily homes. I'd make the argument that for people who live in residential homes, single family homes, they're gonna, when they need a new vehicle, I think the chances of getting them to buy an EV is greater than getting those people who live in apartments to buy an EV. Now, that's a hypothesis. I don't know the answer to that question, but these people have more resources and more money. These people have less resources and less money. So that's the point I'm trying.
Although,
I kind of put the difference a little bit here, because I think where we talk about condos. I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think these are often people, sometimes people with downsize, so
Mhm.
they have the resources. For apartment building, where the rentals, I agree that'd be harder. But I think the point that the Eversource money is there, the state is going to continue to push this, would make it.
Yeah.
I think it's a reason to keep doing that. I don't disagree with for anything we can do to keep keep encouraging residents to do it. You're right, if they have a garage, they'll be able to, the chargers, and frankly, they're going to. I mean, GM just hired this guy who worked for Tesla, the batteries are hiring people, and he says, we're not that far from parity. He said, if you ask me when it's coming, if you can tell me what commodity prices will be over the next 5 years, I could tell you, but they go up and down.
Yeah.
But, it's gonna happen.
I think that the question comes, I mean, first of all, you could say with the prices of some of these apartments, they're not cheap.
Let me put it another way. I think there's more pent up demand that's unsatisfied in a multifamily development than there is in the individual, the issues for individual homeowners, I think. Are issues that are less likely to be affected by anything we could do.
They're micro, yeah,
And they're more macro issues, they're, you know, range anxiety, you know, the typical issues anybody goes through. But the access to charging, you know, on a daily basis isn't a factor, where it is a factor for people in multifamily, that I would think. If we could make that, that's where we could have an impact.
yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I would.
That's hard to do, though. We're finding that it's. As a volunteer on the committee and getting into the sort of the deep, dark crevices of where these people, you know, live and work, and it's hard.
Yeah.
And
We haven't
I
found a way in.
think, I mean, I think that's really one of the challenges, because we don't wanna just sort of make recommendation, you know, we wanna have more of an impact than, you know. But, than just sort of making recommendations or documenting the difficulties, and it's also something that once again goes to more of a regional approach, because you know, your developers are not just Needham, they're, you know, sometimes national, sometimes local. And how do we, you know, is this something we reach out to the Chamber of Commerce Real Estate Committee, reach out to, you know, go beyond the individual managers of, you know, whoever's at Avalon or something, to somebody who's a bigger cheese, at least regionally, who could say, okay, yeah. Here are some of the issues. They might come back and say, well, you know, here's what we would like towns to do, because, I mean, we're not in a position of, you know, where multifamily developers are beating our doors down to come in and build apartments, and if we say, well, if you put in 20 chargers.
I think that's a good idea to reach out to the Chamber of Commerce. I did reach out to our economic development manager to ask if he had suggestions, and I'd gotten the list of properties from Ajay, and unfortunately, he didn't have anyone at those places, but I'm happy to try the Chamber of Commerce.
reach out
and see. Yeah.
To
do
Greg
my-
and Max.
Okay, that would be great.
And see if, you know, there's some, whether it's, there is a real estate committee, or if there's certain subsets within the chamber that, you know, could even help us inform us, you know. I mean, you've done a lot of research gathering, but then it's a question of
Yeah.
practical thing.
Do we know how many of the multifamilies are condominiums here? I mean, because we could also look to see who lives in some of those condominiums and find somebody who's interested in this, who could help us connect with their association.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that.
Well, if you, I mean, if you look and you go to the assessor's database, I do believe condominiums as opposed to apartments. I think they may be distinct, but in any case, you know, there's only so many of them. Yeah, I'm not talking about it like a, you know, if somebody builds a 3-family, it's technically a condominium. I'm talking about the larger ones. And then once we do that, it's fairly straightforward to look at people at that address. And find out somebody who is, we know, Green Needham or otherwise, and say, hey, looking at this. Put us in touch with your condo association.
Yeah. The only other follow-up I had was Nick had asked at the last meeting about other municipalities that require EV chargers in parking lots, as a follow-up from the conversation we had with Paul Malta, based on his research about Wellesley and the Whole Foods. And I think I might have found one community that requires it. so far. Hingham, I have to actually get the language from their
Hmm.
planning board, but it sounded like in 2024, they passed something that when there's a new lot, I think it was over 20 spaces. I haven't gotten the language yet, but that they require EV chargers to be included. So it might be another angle to think about. We are through this grant for the low impact development parking requirements review, going to be looking primarily at things like parking ratios and permeable pavement and things like that. But one of the things we had written into the grant was a future proofing section, and we had specifically listed like looking at EV chargers and how can we make it easier for folks to install EV chargers. So that might be another piece to look at with that.
It's interesting, I mean, if it is Hingham, because that's not
They're an MLP.
traditionally, no, but they're also not really a lefty, you know, it's not Brookline.
No, but they actually have a very restrictive house, they have very few tear downs.
Oh, yeah, they also, and God help you if you put what colored Christmas lights on, that's.
Right, I mean,
But Hingham is not, you
no,
know,
I know,
it's sort of,
no, it's not noted to be super progressive, I
Yeah.
hear you, but they don't have
we've-
this issue that we.
yeah.
But when I
Okay.
find that, I will send.
Yeah,
it to
that'd be
you.
great.
But I think we should resurrect this idea that right now, we're really not doing much advocacy for EV ownership or lease, how much benefit it has. Again, it's a challenge. Should we be doing that or not? I think, you know, as long as the mandates are in place, the prices are close to parity, believe it or not, if you got the right model. So there are cost incentives that still exist. How long that'll be is unclear.
Yeah,
It'll all come down to whether but I still think that people don't think about buying an EV that much. Like they just think about when they go to buy a new car, they either think about the last car they bought and say, I'll get another one of those because it's a good
Yeah.
car. So they buy another, whatever. To think about buying EV requires a shift in consciousness. And either that comes about from yourself or it becomes clear amongst other people in your community who are either advocating for that or who are doing it.
I agree that education piece has to happen and it is included in the roadmap. That's something that we will do. So that's something that we've talked about including with the Electrify Needham campaign. So maybe we can have a separate conversation about what that piece of it should look like. Because I agree, I think there's a lot of education that has to happen to make it.
But it's different than it used to be in that EVs are in conscious, and people know about them. There's almost nobody who doesn't know about them. So it's really about the education to say, by the way, did you know, here's some things you should think, just to get people thinking, why might you want to do it? And we talked about this.
it is something that, if you wanted to, or AJ, if somebody wanted to write a piece that we could put on Green Needham or put in the Observer that, the EV of today is not the EV of 10 years ago. Despite the doubt, here's why you should seriously consider it. It'd be really helpful. Using other mechanisms within the town.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think getting people into vehicles is actually quite important.
I mean, once you drive one, it's really hard to, like, most people, that's the big thing. It's like, oh my God, whoa, this is amazing.
So that, and doing those, show and tell things every year I just don't think it's gonna make it.
No.
It's just, you need more of a constant
Doing like
flow,
it, yeah.
and that's the hard part.
Agree.
I'm thinking about it, honestly, I think that if we had a thing every 2 or 3 months where, a couple of EVs were.
Yeah,
available
EV
for
meetup.
people, why not? And then people come in, they can take a drive and take a spin, and it certainly this sort of exposure thing that goes on over time. I think
Yeah.
that would be nice.
No, I agree. I think people are more likely to buy one if they know someone who has one, so they can ask them, those questions like, oh, do you have a
That
charging
used to
device?"
be-
Like,
I think it was Ford had the tagline of ask someone who drives one. Back in the 70s or something.
Yeah, they were doing all back then.
Yeah. So Fred,
Has anyone heard of a campaign that encourages people to let their neighbor take their electric car out for a spin? I mean, you know, it's probably one of the best ways of convincing people is to let your buddy drive your car. And I forget I've heard that in other circles, just as a way of changing people's minds. So I can't, I'm not much of an ad man or a public relations guy, so I don't know how one would devise such a campaign, but yeah, it'd be kind of fun to, you know, have people do that, but
Well, we did that with Solarize, and what we did with Solarize, our multiple solar is we actually put together a map of where the solar was in Needham and where we got it. And that's the ideal part, but you know, you can't do that. You'd have to reach out to people and say, are you willing to let people know you have an EV? It doesn't have to say, let people to buy it. Would you be willing to let people know you have one? Because, you know, when you see the numbers, if you were able to put the map where all the EVs are in Needham, not that people necessarily want you or let you do, you know, let you do that. I mean, people would see how many more. Most people probably don't realize that there are more than they think.
one thing that might this idea I noticed when I pulled in, there was somebody had a F-150 Lightning in the parking lot, which is the electric Ford, and I know the town has a couple.
We have 2 on order.
Okay, they haven't come
They're
in,
not.
but that's the sort of thing that to bring them to, you know, you can't have a demo where you're running a circular saw off the back of your truck, but to to plug things in and, you know, because I think that's sort of those still have a gee whiz factor. There are other things that, so, you know, I guess we could go on like this, but definitely.
Yeah, I think that should be part of again, like have a separate conversation about it and tie it in with Electrify Needham, which
And
is
it's
gonna be
an
hopefully
ongoing.
comprehensive. Yeah, and figure out how to set something up that's more frequent, but is also sustainable from an effort standpoint.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think
Thinking
that has to
about
be-
that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Fred's idea isn't crazy, it's actually interesting.
no, I think it'd be great.
It's
local,
community based.
you know, when we get into
Block parties.
exactly, block party season, and I'll get my neighbor to bring his Rivian out and we can plug things into it.
Get great deals on Teslas, huh?
Mhm.
Well, used EV market is very good, right?
Mhm.
I know.
Because a lot of the rental companies dumped them because it didn't work for them, you know.
Mhm.
Okay,
To be continued.
and the only other items not reasonably anticipated, I thought I'd bring up. Next, Gabby told me that
Oh,
we're gonna try and have recycling.
Matt
Got Matt.
Tamaris, Matt, who's our recycling and solid waste superintendent, is gonna come to our next meeting on July 8th.
And part of my thought with the CAPC, we had some of our meetings were more information oriented, and I thought, especially with the summer and, you know, to have some of these
Yeah, I think,
blocks where we focus and, you know, do that. And if you have a thought for August,
yeah, I'm hoping
Let
to
me
have Kristen join us, if not the August, then maybe September.
Chris.
Who's our emergency management administrator.
okay,
Her and
Yeah.
Matt were both 2 that had come up at prior CAC meetings of people asking questions about the status of
Okay.
certain topics. And I think both would be helpful to talk to because we have pretty hefty action items in the roadmap for those categories, and we haven't made a ton of headway on them yet, so it might be helpful to hear from them about what they see as a priority from their perspective and where they think the committee could assist them.
Perfect.
But
Okay.
those are the only two that I have in mind, so if folks have other people that they think would be good to invite. Yeah, I'm happy to reach out to anyone you suggest.
Okay. Any other items?
Happy to move to adjourn.
A second? You all
Nobody
want
wants
to
to
You
stay?
need a second? Yes.
Yes. Okay. I guess we need a roll call. Fred,
Yes.
Paul Mulder,
Yep.
Paul, Bell,
Yes.
Michael,
Aye.
Barry,
Yes.
and I.
Thank you.
And we are adjourned until.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
You too.
Right.